Good morning. Hi. I'm Laurel Smith. I'm the provost at Vincennes University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our debate this morning, the beginning of a series of debates this semester on the question of legalization of marijuana. Before I turn that over, I just want to welcome both the students who are here, faculty, staff, and guests from out of town. And again, to encourage you to look for future debates, future events that take on controversial issues to make this, your college experience, intellectually stimulating outside of the classroom as well as inside the classroom. So with that, I will now turn it over to today's moderator, Professor Jessica Zellers.
Good morning. We're really happy that you're all here to join us for this first of several thought-provoking debates held on our campus this year. I'm Jessica Zellers, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Social Work here at Vincennes, and I'll serve as today's moderator. We'd first like to get a sense for where the audience stands on the issue of legalization. So please see your screen. Let's take a minute to make sure, if you haven't already, go ahead and submit your vote or your opinion on this issue so far. For, against, undecided. And you'll see in your programs also, it provides you with kind of an overall format for the debate, including information about how to submit these questions, how to interact with our panel members today. So we're going to go ahead and begin with a brief introduction of our participants. On the side for legalization, which you'll see on the right side of the stage, Michael Mullen has been a professor at Vincennes University for 25 years and teaches classes including composition, literature, speech, journalism, photography, and history. During that time, he served as the advisor for the Trailblazer, our VU student newspaper, for about 8 years. He serves on the boards of the James Jones Literary Society and of the Indiana Collegiate Press Association. He's a strong supporter of the First Amendment and was given the Hoosier Intellectual Freedom Award by the Indiana Library Federation. Additionally, he's received the VU Exemplary Service Award. Welcome to Professor Mullen. Also on the right side of the stage from your vantage point, we have Stephen Dillon. He's been a lawyer in Indiana since 1977. He's a member of the Libertarian Party, the Indiana Civil Liberties Union, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, an ordained minister by the Indiana Association of Spiritualists, and the National Legal Committee for NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Additionally, he helped start the Indiana chapter of NORML in 1974 and has served as state director most years since. He's been very active politically, running for offices including prosecutor of Marion County, Indiana Secretary of State, Indiana Governor, and U.S. Senator. Thanks to Mr. Dillon for being here. On the left from where you sit, on the side against legalization, we have Mike Morris. He's been the sheriff in Knox County since 2009 and has worked in law enforcement for many years. He supervises 27 employees within his department, oversees our local jail, which houses up to 180 prisoners at any given time. Thank you to Mike Morris. And finally, we have Rob Evans, who's worked at Vincennes University for 18 years. He served initially as a full-time drug and alcohol counselor, and for the past 13 years, he's been a full-time professor of sociology and social work. He also works with the Knox County Superior Court and provides court-mandated education for those who've been arrested for drug and alcohol charges. Additionally, he has experience in the community mental health system in Vincennes. He possesses a state license as a clinical social worker and is a certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor in the state of Indiana. Welcome to Professor Evans. Okay, well, we're going to start with a brief 7 to 10 minute presentation first by those who wish to change the laws towards legalization. Gentlemen, the stage is yours.
Let's legalize pot. People should not be arrested, prosecuted, or imprisoned for possession or use of marijuana. The cultivation of marijuana or cannabis has existed for at least 9,000 years. Cannabis-based textiles dating back to 7,000 BCE have been recovered in northern China. It was used as a medicine in the Xinlong dynasty in China 5,000 years ago. Over 2 pounds of cannabis have been recently discovered in a 27-year-old grave of an ancient shaman in Central Asia. Over 22 million people were arrested for marijuana in the United States since 1965. 88% of those arrested for possession of a small amount of marijuana only. According to the 2013 ACLU report, The War on Marijuana in Black and White, marijuana arrests have increased between 2001 and 2010 and now account for over half, 52% of all drug arrests in the United States. 46% of those arrests were for possession of marijuana only. There were 889,133 marijuana arrests in the United States in 2010. That was one marijuana arrest every 37 seconds. That means 16 of us will be arrested for marijuana while Mike and I make our initial presentation today. According to the ACLU report, a black person is about 4 times, 3.73, more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though they use at similar rates. In Knox County, blacks were 5.6 times more likely to be arrested than a white person for marijuana. It's the 4th highest county in the state in 2010. The prohibition was racist when it started in 1937, and it continues today, the new Jim Crow. It has needlessly ensnared millions of people in the criminal justice system, had a staggeringly disproportionate impact on African Americans, and comes at a tremendous human and financial cost. The price paid by those arrested and convicted of marijuana possession can be significant and linger for years, if not a lifetime. It has been a fiscal fiasco, with the combined state's cost of enforcing marijuana laws estimated at least $3.6 billion a year, in addition to the federal cost of the marijuana prohibition estimated at $6 to $10 billion a year. What a waste of law enforcement resources. Indiana is number 1 in the country in meth labs. And narcotic pills and heroin are causing an epidemic of overdoses, HIV, and hepatitis infections in Indiana. Yet, we focus our resources on marijuana offenses. Indiana spends approximately $149 million a year arresting, prosecuting, and jailing over 15,000 of our citizens for marijuana offenses each of the past few years. I was in the Indiana legislature a couple years ago, and a Senate committee considered changes to our penal code. A full day of hearings described the drug problems in Indiana. Heroin, cocaine, narcotic pills, and methamphetamine were the problem drugs. Marijuana wasn't even mentioned. I suggested that we spend our $149 million a year enforcing laws against methamphetamine, heroin, and narcotic pills, and not marijuana offenses. Our citizens agree that marijuana should be legalized, that people should not be arrested or go to jail for pot. A 2013 Gallup poll reported that 58% of Americans want legal marijuana. In Indiana, a 2013 Howie DePaul poll reported that 56% of Hoosiers want decriminalized marijuana. A 2013 Bowen Center Public Affairs poll reported that 52% of Hoosiers want decriminalized marijuana. And a 2013 Wish TV Ball State poll reported that 78% of Hoosiers want marijuana legalized, taxed, and regulated like alcohol. As Mason Vert from MPP recently remarked, marijuana prohibition is a government failure that forces marijuana into the black market, contributing to drug trafficking and violence. A legal marijuana market would allow for more control and generate tax revenue. As Normal's Keith Stropp has consistently said since 1970, we need to remove all criminal penalties for possession and responsible use of marijuana by adults for therapeutic, spiritual, and social purposes, including the cultivation for personal use and for caregivers, and the transfer of small amounts. NORML supports the development of a legally controlled market for marijuana, where consumers can purchase it from a safe, legal, and regulated source. NORML supports the right of patients to use marijuana as a medicine when their physician recommends it to relieve pain and suffering. NORML also supports the right of farmers to commercially cultivate the non-psychoactive strain of cannabis known as hemp for industrial purposes such as food, fuel, and fiber production. The ACLU report recommends legalization of marijuana for persons 21 years or older through a system of taxation, licensing, and regulation as the surest way to end targeted enforcement of marijuana in communities of color and eliminate the cost of such ineffective enforcement while generating revenue for cash-strapped states estimated at $8.7 billion to $31 billion a year. Colorado recognized $1.2 million from sales taxes on marijuana in January of this year alone. The continued war on marijuana is a war on us. We need to get involved to restore Americans' liberty and freedom. The prohibition is destroying our country and darkening our spirits. As Abraham Lincoln said, prohibition goes beyond the bounds of reason, and that it attempts to control a man's appetite by legislation and makes a crime out of things that are not crimes. A prohibition law strikes a blow at the very principles upon which our government was founded. The prohibition is ineffective. Over 100 million citizens have tried it, 42% of the people over 12. The prohibition is costly, hundreds of billions spent with millions of lives and careers ruined. The prohibition is racist, with a 4 times black to white arrest ratio, leading to mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow. The prohibition prevents full use of medical marijuana. The prohibition is based on lies. This prohibition is even worse than the failed alcohol prohibition. Most of us know it's time to end this madness. No one should go to jail for marijuana.
A lot of extra credit here today. Grade point average of VU is going to go up this semester. Steve talked about the racist nature of marijuana. I wanted to start by talking about that because it drove so much of this initially. Following the Mexican Civil War, which started in 1920 and ended about a decade later, many Mexicans moved up in the United States. And at the time, 90% of Mexicans in the U.S. were concentrated in 4 states: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And we didn't like them. They created a labor glut, and they were willing to work for less than the prevailing wages. And since it was known that the Mexicans used marijuana recreationally, this was used as an excuse to try to push the Mexicans back south into Mexico. Other ethnic groups at the time had more marijuana arrests than Mexicans, and the arrest rate for the Chinese was highest of all. This fact was ignored because the Chinese weren't creating trouble in the labor market the way the Mexicans were. And when Montana outlawed marijuana in 1927, a legislator commented, "When some beet field peon takes a few traces of this stuff, he thinks he has just been elected president of Mexico, so he starts out to execute all his political enemies." On the floor of the Texas Senate, a senator announced, "All Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff," speaking of marijuana, "is what makes them crazy." In the East, the problem was much smaller with the Mexican population, but marijuana there was associated with Latin Americans, African Americans, and jazz musicians. And I think the racist nature of the prohibition is seen most clearly in statements that Henry Anslinger made. That's probably his most famous statement. He said a lot of other things, too, that are kind of troubling. He said marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. He said you smoke a joint and you're likely to kill your brother. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. When I was doing some research for this, a modern commentator said that the most likely victim of violence at the hands of a pot smoker is a bag of Cheetos. As Steve Dillon mentioned, marijuana prohibition is still very racist today, and often worse than the arrest and sentencing are the sanctions that frequently go along with the marijuana arrest. In life sentences, the collateral sanctions associated with marijuana offenses, Richard Glenn Bohr says, Collateral sanctions triggered by a marijuana conviction include revocation or suspension of professional licenses, barriers to employment or promotion, loss of educational aid, driver's license suspension, and bars on adoption, voting, and jury service. For people who depend on public assistance, a marijuana conviction can trigger a bar on receiving food stamps and restrict access to public houses. In some states, these sanctions continue for life. And I think with this issue, we're really barking up the wrong tree. There's ample evidence to suggest that marijuana is a relatively harmless drug. In Reefer Madness, Eric Schlosser cites a study that suggests that heavy, daily marijuana smokers have a mortality rate indistinguishable from that of non-users. And LD50 is a measurement of toxicity that indicates the amount of a material given at one time which causes death in 50% of a group of test animals. Researchers have tried without success to establish a figure for marijuana because they've been unable to give animals enough marijuana to kill them. And according to the U.S. Department of Justice, this is a quote, "At present it is estimated that marijuana's LD is around 1 to 20,000 or 1 to 40,000. In layman terms, this means that in order to induce death, a marijuana smoker would have to consume 20 to 40,000 times as much marijuana as is contained in one marijuana cigarette. A smoker would theoretically have to consume nearly 1,500 pounds of marijuana in about 15 minutes to induce a lethal response." And so a much larger problem, I think, is there's another great comment. Richard Nixon also weighed in on this. The racism that drove this certainly has been around for a long time. You can see from this chart the toxicity of marijuana is nothing compared to a lot of other issues that seem to be far more pressing. And one of the things that surprised me in doing a lot of this research is how much of this information has been around for decades. A lot of what we know indicating that marijuana is a relatively harmless drug we've known for 50 years. We just have ignored it. And
Thank you so much, Professor Mullins.
Okay. Thank you.
And now for the case against legalization.
I knew this would be an uphill battle. But I recognize that a lot of you would like to see marijuana legalized. And what I'm asking for, though, during this debate is for you guys to keep an open mind. And I suspect you'll learn a few things that may change your mind on that. So let's go ahead and take a look at the case against legalization. There are 4 reasons that I'm going to maintain that it is not a good idea to legalize marijuana. First off, there's employment implications, and these are significant regardless of whether it's legalized in the state of Indiana. This is something you have to pay close attention to as students here at VU and as citizens. There's also public safety issues. This is not completely a safe drug, and NORML will admit as much when they say that we should not drive under the influence of marijuana. It clearly does cloud people's thinking. It does affect people's ability to gauge distance, to make good judgments. I don't think I've ever seen NORML advocate driving a vehicle under the influence of marijuana. They recognize that it is dangerous under certain circumstances. So let's not say that it's completely harmless. That's a myth. Mental health implications. With mental health implications, my background being a drug and alcohol counselor, I can tell you I've seen it firsthand, but I'm not going to just talk about my firsthand experiences. I'm going to talk about what we know in the mental health field. And we know a lot over the years in treating those folks who've had problems related to this. And lastly, as much as our opponents would love for you to believe that there'll be this huge savings and that we're wasting all this money on going after marijuana use, there has been no reduction in prison populations in the states that have legalized it. None. We see prison populations going up because the reality is most people who go to prison are not there for simple possession, as Sheriff Mike Morris can bring up data on that later. But let's look into this first point. It will derail a career, folks, and I want you to fully understand that when you want to get hired on a job, it is a company's right to screen you for marijuana. It is absolutely a deal breaker for public safety, for firefighters, for police officers, for nurses, for airline pilots, for truck drivers. They get drug tested. And so if you want to give up a career, and I know all of you are working very hard to try to get a career, to move up the ladder, legalization does nothing but regulate you to a low-end job. And that's not what is in your own best interest. And I think if you think about it, you would realize that even if we legalize it, we still have a problem of trying to get a good-paying job. Now, it doesn't just end there. Once you get that job, you also have some problems, even if you have a medical marijuana card. Consider the fact you get that job. Maybe you can get past that hair follicle test. Maybe you can get past that mouth swab. Maybe you can cheat your way into it because you don't want your employer to know you're using, because they will not hire you in many cases. If you get injured on the job, the first thing they're going to do is workman's comp is going to ask for a drug test. And as soon as that happens, workman's comp is going to deny you benefits because you have marijuana in your system, and you'll probably lose your job. So, folks, it's quite clear. Don't think that if we legalize marijuana in Indiana next week, that suddenly you can go smoke and not worry about losing your job. In fact, you have a real risk. You are running a risk on this. And I want to point out that this is a private sector thing. This is not the government. The private sectors, again, Boeing and Honda and Toyota, all the companies that we've been successful in getting into Indiana, they make those decisions. And so legalization has absolutely no impact on that. In Colorado right now, where it's legal, they can be fired from jobs. Even with a medical marijuana card, it went to Colorado State Supreme Court and also California State Supreme Court, and they said, you don't get protection for a medical marijuana card, you're fired. And a company can do that. Now, you may not like that. You may see that as unfair, but that's the reality. And you need to understand, if we're being honest, our opponents, are kind of shuffling people into lower-paying jobs if they choose to smoke marijuana. Now, it's also an impact on our state. And if we look at the states that are doing well in getting jobs to come to the state, we'll notice that Indiana is doing quite well. And that's the blue line. We have North Carolina. We have Kansas. All those states, interestingly enough, the ones that are attracting high-paying jobs, they don't have medical marijuana. They don't have legalized marijuana. Let's take a look at the states that do. Let's see how they're doing financially. I think you're going to find that those states, take a look how they're doing. They're getting an F, according to Business Insider, in terms of recruiting good businesses. Colorado, California, Illinois, Washington, Oregon. It sure sounds to me like this is bad business. If I'm a business, if I'm a corporation, and I want to set down another plant for Honda, another plant for Toyota, I don't want to contend with marijuana smokers, because if I drug test my potential employees, look how many of them are going to fail. This is a huge advantage for Indiana to stay away from marijuana, and it is important for you guys to consider that. Just don't look at your own self-interest. Look at the state's health, and I think it's going to be damaged by legalization. Okay, now on public safety, I think Normal will agree you should not drive under the influence. For those of you who think you drive better when you're high, think again. A recent study, an Australian study, found that at any measure of THC in the bloodstream, a driver is twice as likely to be in a fatal car accident. But at 5 nanograms, which, by the way, is the number in Washington, 5 nanograms, it jumps to 6.6 times more likely. So Washington State has 5 nanograms. And at that point, it's already been proven to be less safe. And what about, again, you have a little bit more than that in your system, and then you're looking at public safety is a major one. Now, let's also say that Mike Mullen was talking about dosing in animals. I don't think he's looked at edibles. Edibles that are being sold in Colorado, which are the lion's share of the business, edibles have massive amounts of THC in them, huge amounts, way more than you can ingest by smoking. And in fact, we've had people who've had psychotic breaks because they've eaten so much candy. They think they're not getting the effect. They're impatient. And then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 hours later, and we've had 2 suicides that were directly attributable to it because they were normal, healthy, well-adjusted college students who ingested large amounts of candy with THC in it and began to act bizarrely. One jumped to their death in the University of Colorado, one shot themselves. So, this idea that marijuana is completely benign, when you get to those levels of THC, that massive amount in the candy, we're talking about a whole other ballgame. And I think that NORML has to recognize there are safety issues with that. They can't simply ignore it and write it off. All right. When we talk about crime, and again, this is a big issue, what's going to happen to crime? One thing that we do know is that crime has been dropping before all this legalization talk began. Crime has been consistently dropping, so NORML can't claim there's going to be a drop in crime. We've already seen a lot of improvement with violent crime, and you can see on that chart for particularly for homicides. The national trend has been very, very clear. Crime is dropping as we speak. Now, let me hit the one of the concerns I've got is that in legalization, you have these dispensaries. And when you have dispensaries, places that sell this stuff, what happens around those dispensaries? There was a study done in September 2014 by University of Virginia economics professor. And allowing for marijuana retail stores called dispensaries increases overall state property crime rates to go up by 8.12% and increases robbery rates by 10.98%. That's a huge jump in crime because of these dispensaries. This is because it's cash business. People are carrying large amounts of cash. They're easy targets. And if you want to have a dispensary in your neighborhood, just get ready for armed robberies to happen. I don't think that's really what you want. It's not a good policy. Now, what can we say about the mental health aspects? We know there's lower academic performance. You may disagree. You may say, my personal experience is that I do just fine with marijuana, but the facts tell us otherwise. A huge study that over a 10-year period indicated very clear declines in academic performances, and VU themselves, you'll notice, in our recent survey, had much lower GPA for those who regularly smoke. That's by their own report. That's not any numbers I'm trying to put into their mouths. So they're going to drop in terms of their performance. And lastly, there's also the issue of mental health. Now, I want to be clear on this. Marijuana does not cause schizophrenia. Marijuana does not cause bipolar. But what marijuana does, and this is well established, is it makes them more likely to have a psychotic episode or a psychotic break. It does not cause it. And anyone who says it causes that is irresponsible. But you're just as irresponsible to say that it has no impact on someone who's bipolar or someone who's schizophrenic. It does cause psychotic breaks. Talk to anyone in the mental health field. It is a well-established fact, and we've got some research up there to kind of bear that out as well, too. Lastly, let's take a look at the prison populations of the places that have legalized marijuana starting back in 1998. So keep in mind, medical marijuana was passed in a lot of these states quite a while ago. And if we look at Oregon, it's pretty clear. People go to prison not for marijuana, but for all kinds of other things. So this idea of decriminalizing marijuana, we're going to empty our jails, is just not true. Take a look at another state that legalized marijuana. What's happened to theirs? Alaska, also 1998, medical marijuana. And prison populations continue to rise because the reality is prison is used for those who have serious violent felonies, drug felonies also, but large amounts, repeat offenses. A misdemeanor charge of marijuana is not going to get you long-term jail and prison. So the facts speak for themselves. There's no reduction in those things. So for those 4 reasons, employment, because of your inability to get that job, to maintain that job, because public safety is so important, and because there really is mental health issues and really no savings, I urge you to think cautiously about legalizing marijuana in Indiana. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. So we have a number of questions prepared for our panel in addition to a few that we will ask that have been submitted by our audience today. So to start off, Let's start again on the right side, on the pro-legalization side. What differences or similarities can you describe? You mentioned it briefly in your opening. Tell us a little bit more about some of the similarities or differences that you see between America's failed experiment with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and the marijuana prohibition of today.
The marijuana prohibition is another government failure very similar to the failed alcohol prohibition. Both prohibitions made millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens into criminals. Both led to a rise in organized crime and violence. Both led to increased corruption of government and law enforcement officials. Both lost to a loss of respect or trust in our government. Both led to exposure of our citizens to dangerous people and more dangerous substances. Both led to expensive law enforcement costs, a waste of taxpayer resources. Both were totally ineffective. Marijuana use increased from a small percentage of the population to 42% of the adult population, despite a great increase in arrests and convictions. It went from 100,000 users in 1937 to 100 million users today, a 1,000% increase. The federal marijuana prohibition is based on racist lies in 1937 and control over people, reefer madness. The alcohol prohibition has only lasted 13 years, but the marijuana prohibition has lasted 78 years. The marijuana prohibition has resulted in millions of arrests with horrible consequences beyond anything realized by the alcohol prohibition. I asked my opponents, it took a constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, to give the federal government the authority to regulate alcohol. Where does the government get the authority to prohibit marijuana without such amendments? Prohibition is crumbling. 23 states have full medical use. 14 states have CBDs. We have 4 legal states in D.C. Prohibitionists have lost public support. They don't have the facts, and they're left with fear and myths. The fears are, by the prohibitionists, as some of you have heard, that crime will skyrocket, youth will use more, and organized crime will take it over, and tobacco will take over, and traffic fatalities will rise, and it's too dangerous. But that's not the truth. The truth is that cannabis regulation is associated with decreases in violent crime. Cannabis regulation is not associated with increased use among young people. Organized crime is moving away from the cannabis business. Tobacco use among teens is at historic lows. Cannabis regulation is not associated with increased traffic fatalities. Voters today support legalization in record numbers, and cannabis is comparably safer than conventional medicines and intoxicants, clearly safer than alcohol. Regulation is controls. If it was legalized, we control who can produce it, who can distribute it, who can consume it, where adults can get it, and it's for adults. Prohibition is the absence of controls, and it jeopardizes rather than promotes public safety. Prohibition advocates the control of production and distribution to entrepreneurs, drug cartels, street gangs, and street dealers who push additional legal substances. Prohibition it provides young people with easier access to marijuana than alcohol. Prohibition promotes the use of marijuana in inappropriate settings, such as automobiles. Nobody wants you to drive stoned. In public parks or public restrooms. Prohibition promotes disrespect for the law and reinforces ethnic and generation divides between the public and law enforcement. The prohibition is a failure. The prohibition is illogical. The prohibition is upwards of 50,000 Americans are behind bars in this country right now for violating marijuana laws. And we're spending more than $1 billion a year to put 50,000 people behind bars for pot. They are in prison for pot. They're in prison in Indiana for pot. Indiana has 1,300 marijuana offenders in state prisons in Indiana in 2012 for marijuana. At a cost of about $60,000 a year.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dillon.
Thank you.
We have a response? Now for a response.
As a response to public safety, first off, everybody, glad you all showed up for this debate this morning, this afternoon. It's going to be hotly contested throughout the upcoming months and possibly upcoming years. But our esteemed counselor brought up a situation concerning Knox County, which I can only speak for Knox County. When I speak for other counties, state of Indiana, I'll speak for the county that I've been elected to protect. As of January 1st, 2015, to yesterday's date, not today, we've had 38 possession of marijuana arrests. 38 in 9 months. Okay? We've had numerous, I couldn't even tell you how many, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, everything. You know, it was mentioned early on in the initial response that we focus our resources on marijuana. As a police officer in the state of Indiana or anywhere in the United States, you take an oath to serve and protect. And that is through state statutes. You know, agree with them or not, and understand everybody has their opinion. I agree with you 100%. I'll back you 100% on your opinion. But as long as there's a state statute, and it is an enforceable state statute, they will be enforced. And as far as legalization goes, you know, I personally am against it. You know, this is my 38th year doing this job. You know, we have a jail capacity of 224, which is quite a few for a small county. We're down to 154 now. Of that 154, we have one dealing in marijuana still incarcerated. So the numbers locally, now if you go over the year, go back a couple years, it would be higher. But all of our data is easily collectible through our CAD system, with the Interact CAD system, so it can be produced. But it's something that, with alcohol, I agree also that the prohibition that keeps being mentioned, that, you know, we work traffic fatalities in our county regularly, okay? We're responsible for our highways, county roads, streets, whatever you want to call them. And we do have numerous traffic fatalities in our county. A lot of them are alcohol related. And we have some that test positive for THC or marijuana. Not getting into legal issues of it, the verbiage of it. I'm not a doctor. I just know what our state statutes say. So, do we want anybody to smoke dope and drive? No, absolutely not. Do we want somebody to consume alcoholic beverages and drive? Absolutely not. Both of them are potential killers of innocent people. Not going into nanograms, manograms, or whatever else. It's just the fact that both of the substances can impair your judgment. So, if it's legal, it's legal. If it's not, we're going to enforce the state statutes of the state of Indiana, and that's what will be done. So, I will pass it on to Mr. Evans.
Thank you.
I just want to say briefly that our opponents are talking about what percentage of folks that would like to see marijuana legalized. I think it's pretty treacherous ground to lean on public opinion strictly to make policy. Because if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a time where the public opinion was interracial marriages shouldn't be allowed. Now, that majority of people didn't want that. And if we want to say, well, that's the best way to get policy, is the majority of people say that, and that's what we should follow, I think most of us today would understand that's bad policy. So to sit there and say that, oh, all these people want it, therefore it's good, is just not good policy. And I can give you an example after example where times where people said, majority of people said, this is what we should do, but looking back on it, it was bad policy. Segregation was highly, highly supported by the public. And surely Steve Dillon and Mike Mullen wouldn't suggest that was good policy. You can't use surveys to establish just in fact that this is good policy. Sometimes you have to look at the bigger picture, which is safety, public safety, and also look at the implications for the state.
Thank you. Let's move on for a minute and think a little bit about the logistics, about what legalization in reality would look like. So we'd love to hear a little bit on the pro side to start with. If marijuana were to be legalized, and this is kind of combining a couple of questions we've received from our audience, Is it something that you feel should be allowed on college campuses? Is it something that would be restricted by age in a similar way that alcohol is? What would be limits in terms of price, legal limit, legal buying age? What would this look like if it were to be legalized?
I'll let my partner here talk about some of the details, since as his role on the normal board, he's a lot more familiar with what's going on in the states that have legalized it than I am. But I think what we would be talking about would be something similar to what those models have. We're talking about adults only. We're talking about not people getting behind the wheels of cars, all that kind of stuff. It seems that Colorado and Washington and states that have legalized it are offering a way to show how this could be achieved in a way that would benefit society and minimize its harms. And I'll let Steve talk a little bit about the details of how these states operate.
Thanks, Mike. You know, marijuana legalization will provide a substantial economic boost to Indiana, not a hardship. We'll save the $149 million a year in law enforcement and realize $50 to $100 million in sales tax revenue. It'll help our economy not to arrest over 15,000 Hoosiers a year who lose their jobs, careers, school assistance, even if not imprisoned. I'm not aware of any significant detrimental effects to society as a whole in the places that have legalized. And we can look at what's happened. You know, between 73 and 78, 13 states decriminalized. Like Ohio in 75. Did they have generations of brain-damaged people and violent crime going out? No, they don't have that kind of problem at all. We now have 4 legal states plus D.C. where you can have up to half a pound in your home without a penalty. In Oregon, 2 ounces in most places. You can be in public with an ounce or 2, and it's not even a criminal offense. It's very civilized. You know, marijuana was legal most of the history of our country. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin all approved of the hemp and marijuana plant. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. When we talk about legalizing marijuana, we're talking about really legalizing marijuana. It's only been illegal for the last period of time. We've got a good track record. And, you know, I trust Americans to make good decisions, but they make decisions not only in their personal experience, these 100 million Americans, but based on research studies going back to the 1850s showing marijuana is safe and effective and one of the safest therapeutic substances known to man, the DEA judge in 1988. So I don't buy into this mental health problem. I don't buy into a safety or violence problem. And the reason perhaps there's no reduction in prison populations is now the police have time to arrest real criminals and put them away. And they don't have to build more prisons. And one more thing. The sheriff pointed out that there's only been 38 possession of marijuana arrests and 1 for dealing. 39 arrests, 1 for dealing, 38 for possession. It's back to that 88% of the people arrested possess a little bit of marijuana only. And historically, they're young males, Hispanic and black. And apparently that's the case here. So there's a great benefit to legalization. Don't lose your career. It doesn't mean you're going to smoke and drive. NORML has always encouraged responsible adult use of cannabis, and that doesn't include driving. But you know, the statistics show that marijuana is one of the safest substances you could ever have and drive and operate a car. There's no comparison between other drugs and alcohol effect on impairment. And the other problem with drug testing is, folks, is you don't measure impairment. When they do a urine test, they get your passive THC metabolites showing you used pot sometimes in the last 6 to 8 weeks. That doesn't mean you're impaired and dangerous to drive. You know, the future is bright. Is that time? Time's up.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mr. Dillon.
Steve talked about it being a very safe drug back in the 1850s, that it was used heavily. I seem to recall cocaine was also widely used and seen as safe. Is that not correct? going back and saying, well, because it was true back in the 1800s means it's really going to be really good policy. We know a lot more about marijuana today than we did back in the 1800s. And the facts are, as much as someone may say it's not true, in mental health, there is something called cannabis dependence. Now, people may not want to hear that, but the reality is I see people all the time who have probation hanging over their head. They are not going to jail for possession, for simple possession. They don't. They get a citation and they're released. What they go to jail for is they continue to smoke pot while on probation, which asks the question, why are they doing that? If it's not addictive, you just quit. But I've worked for many, many years whose people say it is very, very difficult after smoking it for so long just to go ahead and walk away from it. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people taken to jail for failing drug screens for a violation of their probation. So this idea that it's harmless is absolutely not true. Cannabis dependence has been recognized by the American Psychological Association for decades. And there is a lot of research which indicates there's tolerance, there is an inability to cut down and quit, there is a slight withdrawal so that when you're quitting, you're irritable. Your appetite is off, and those who are heavy smokers know exactly what I'm talking about. The tolerance is quite clear. Now, let me also just conclude, too, about how there's no crime. I think that statistics I gave before was overlooked. Around dispensaries, crime has gone up dramatically. Remember, these dispensaries are operating on a cash-only basis. And they estimated between 8 to 10% increase in violent crime around dispensaries. Now, if that's not compelling, do you want a dispensary around your house? If that's what you want, I hope you're well armed because the chance of being robbed is substantial. It's not safe. It's not safe for mental health. And if it was, last thing I'll say on this, if it was as safe as Steve Dillon is saying, then why not let kids smoke it? Normal?
Thank you.
Normal? Would you?
Thank you.
Let me ask Normal. Would Normal say that kids could smoke? Now, if he says, listen up, guys, if he says that no, kids should not smoke, that means there's obviously some danger to it. Otherwise, he'd say, sure, let them smoke. What's your response to that, Steve?
First, let me talk about robberies. If the United States let these dispensaries use banks, they wouldn't get robbed. And traditionally, it's always been the position of Normal that responsible adults use marijuana. And we do that because the adolescent brain still is developing into the teens, and it makes good sense that you're fully developed with your brain before you make the choice to use a drug. I think it should be 18 instead of 21, but 21 is what it is. I will say that for medical marijuana, there are hundreds, if not thousands, probably more than that, thousands for sure of children all over the United States that are benefiting from medical marijuana through epilepsy disorders that can't be controlled any other way. And that's the children that should be using medical marijuana. But I don't think they should make a choice for any recreational drugs until you're 18 or 21, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or marijuana.
Thank you. Got 1 more minute for a response. Go ahead.
I agree with what Rob said about cocaine being a problem. Opium was too. It was a huge problem. But interestingly enough, marijuana smoking increased during Prohibition eras. I mean, there's ample evidence in this country and the rest of the world that Prohibition really only causes people to often go to more harmful, dangerous substances. And I think you're right. In a sense, public opinion should not drive certain debates, certainly interracial marriage. But I think the other side of the coin would be the gay marriage issue, which 10 or 20 years ago, I would have thought it inconceivable that we would go that far because public opinion was very much against it. So I think we know a lot more about the safety of marijuana than we ever did before. So I think the information has been there. We haven't paid attention to it. It's time to do that, I think.
Thank you very much. We've got about 1 more minute for follow-up, and then we'll head into kind of our closing question.
But you would admit that edibles present a significant health issue in these dispensaries, that this is a whole another level of THC. Is that correct from the normal perspective?
I'll let him address the normal perspective. When I was doing my research, I came across those same examples that Rob mentioned. Those are the only examples I saw of anybody having problems like that. So I think they are such isolated cases that I don't think that really represents the danger of this. And I think if it did turn out that proved to be the case, I think these states would do something in response to that.
You know, in Colorado, teen use was down in 2012, 13, and 14, even with the legalization. Fatal car crashes were down in 2014 in Colorado. Felony crime was down 5% in 2014 in Colorado. Misdemeanor crime was down 10% in 2014 in Colorado. 0 out of 20 stores send cannabis to underage drivers. $60 million at least was saved in law enforcement costs. Unemployment dropped in Colorado from 6.9% to 4.2% in 2015. The unhappy news from Colorado, the cartels aren't happy. You know, that marijuana's going for $100 an ounce. I was in Oregon last week, billboard, $79 an ounce. By golly. And the idea that marijuana leads to insanity or lacks safety is just ridiculous. That's the reason it's in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act, that there's no accepted medical use in the United States and it lacks safety under medical supervision, and marijuana doesn't qualify under either one of those categories.
Thank you.
Marijuana is one of the safest therapeutic substances known to man.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to have to move into kind of our closing remarks, our closing question for today. We're going to start with the left side of our stage with Professor Evans and Sheriff Morris. And so give us kind of just your closing thoughts, and also just for you, what is the most compelling reason that Indiana, in your perspective, either should or should not go ahead and legalize marijuana? Kind of give us your thoughts on that and any other closing remarks you may have.
I think the most compelling one is, if nothing else, a self-serving one for our participants, which is if you want a good-paying job, and that's a fact, guys, you're going to get drug tested. And once you get that job, you better hope and pray you don't get injured on the job, because if you do, workman's comp will drug test you, and you will lose a career. There is nothing that Steve Dillon or Mike Mullen can say that has absolutely nothing to do with legalization. If we were to legalize it next week, you still have to face the fact that you're choosing between smoking marijuana and a real good job, a real career. And let's not forget that, because what else are we giving up? We're giving up public safety. There's no questions that edibles are extremely dangerous. They've caused the uptick in the number of emergency room admissions for children who ingested marijuana has skyrocketed. And frankly, the black market has taken off in Colorado because they tax it at such a high rate there. A lot of people are selling marijuana on their own for less than what the dispensaries can sell. So there's been no evidence at all, not a single piece of evidence that Steve Dillon or Mike Mullen can offer you that organized crime is going to go away. They've been around a long time, and they'll be around for a long time. So I urge you to consider what is going to happen to our state when it comes to attracting good jobs. What's going to happen to our state when we have young people using this stuff, and they are. Again, this is as much as we say they shouldn't do it, it's going to be available to them. So I think, again, there are a lot of good reasons to argue against legalization. At the very least, again, public safety is very, very important, as well as your career in some type of job. Thank you.
Sheriff, would you like to add anything?
Again, going back to enforcement, okay? You know, everybody looks at the pounds, the grams, and so forth. That's, you know, what's going to determine that? What's going to be safe usages? What's going to prove impairment? You know, just because you have THC or alleged marijuana substances in your body, a law enforcement officer, a prosecutor, and a court, you have to prove impairment no matter what. Okay? Just because you have it in your system doesn't mean you're impaired. You have to prove impairment, correct? But for the DUI. It falls under the Schedule 1 controlled substance. What I'm getting at is that legalizing.
We'll share with you. We'll share with you. Sheriff Morris, you can finish your thoughts first if you have any other thoughts, and then we'll pass it on to our other side.
Yeah. No. And I'm sure Mr. Dillon would agree with that also, that, it's any substance, alcoholic beverages, marijuana, whatever, as far as public safety can and will be an issue. Just because you smoke marijuana, it's not going to be a utopia. Just because you consume alcoholic beverages, it's not going to make you better. Just because you snort cocaine, you're not going to get stronger. And just because you smoke methamphetamine, don't make you King Kong, okay? Marijuana is the same thing. That's what I just got at, if you didn't hear it when I spoke of it. Any foreign substance, marijuana, any of the others, can cause impairment. And I don't think anybody can argue with that too much, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
First, let me say that, if marijuana were legal, we wouldn't have all these employment tests. And if they would measure impairment on the job, then it would be reasonable. And, of course, pilots should be tested, but not everybody. You got to have a reliable test. Let's just talk about the reasons why. The most compelling reason that marijuana should be legalized in Indiana is allow full research into its wonderful medical uses for many conditions and diseases. The Careers Act, the Compassionate Access Research Expansion and Respect States Act, the first medical marijuana bill in Senate history, is now pending in the Senate. And if passed, will reverse the government prohibition on research. They don't allow any research. Legalization will restore our American right to choose to use marijuana instead of a more dangerous recreation or medical drugs, to restore liberty and eliminate racist enforcement of this costly and ineffective prohibition. It's time to legalize marijuana, folks.
For me, I think it boils down to this. More than 40% of adult Americans have admitted to using marijuana. So they think that's the number who admits it, so they suspect it is considerably higher, which really means it's a pretty good chance that the person sitting next to you has tried marijuana. Do you really believe that that person should be jailed or denied student aid or lose his or her driver's license for using marijuana? Should lives be ruined for using a drug that at least 3 presidents and many famous, successful people like Bill Gates, LeBron James, Ted Turner, Oprah Winfrey, and, of course, Willie Nelson have all admitted using marijuana? I mean, I think we all know which side is right here and what needs to be done. I think it's time to take the responsible step and move ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for our guests. Thank you for our audience for being here today. We'd like to ask you one more time as we wrap up today to go ahead and vote one more time about where you're standing on this issue, for, against, or undecided. Thank you to all of our panelists and for you to being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.